everyone, it's Alan. I'd just like to thank you for supporting the Grisly Tales podcast, and we need your help to keep it going too. If you would like to sponsor the show, we would love to hear from you. And if you would be so kind, every time you listen to the podcast, if you're really enjoying it, perhaps you could click onto robsonsworld.com and donate whatever it is you can afford to help us just keep it going. If you can't afford anything, I absolutely understand, but we need your help if you can. Now, let's have some more of those grisly tales. Hi everybody, welcome to another of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales, or 3 or 4. And we always start with something that's a bit off the wall, just to put a grin on your chops and make you shake your head in disbelief. But everything I'm about to tell you is completely true. I'm starting with something that is an uncomfortable topic, really. It's bestiality. The love of people getting it on with animals, essentially. And this isn't a new thing, so don't think that it is. Because Ice Age cave art in hundreds of different places show pictures of a man on skis having sex with an elk, or a moose, or a sheep, or a horse, or a cow. All of those things shown on prehistoric cave art. So it went on. Middle Eastern cave paintings also show that men once believed that sex with female crocodiles would bring them success in life. If they still had a life, that is. The Incas, got a lot of time for the Incas. The Incas had laws to prevent llama drivers from having sex with their llamas, and they enforced it by saying that if anybody was a llama driver, they had to be escorted by a chaperone, unless the chaperone fancied a bit of the action too. Now, let's go to Russia. Frederick the Great. Now, it's well known in historical circles that Frederick the Great never slept with his wife. Never happened, never consummated the thing. And it was rumoured later on that the reason that he'd never dallied with his wife, although she was a fine-looking woman, was because he was in the middle of a particularly rancid relationship with his pack of Italian whippet bitches. They loved him, and he maybe loved them a bit much. Now, a famous poet in Britain is Charles Swinburne, Algernon Charles Swinburne. And he once admitted in a room full of dignitaries that people should not judge those that have had sex with their animals, because even he had copulated with a monkey. Warren Drake was a soldier serving in the Utah militia in Echo Canyon in Utah, and he was found guilty of having sex with a female horse, a mare. The court-martial sentenced Drake and the mare to death. The soldier's sentence was then commuted to exile from the territory. However, his girlfriend, the horse, was executed. You cannot believe these things, but they're absolutely true. A man in Nigeria back in the 50s was accused of committing an act of sexual indecency with a pigeon in Hyde Park. His defense counsel told the judge of a precedent from back in 1930 when a man was accused of buggering a duck. On that occasion, the accused had escaped scot-free because he pointed out that a duck was a fowl, therefore a bird, and it was not a beast. So therefore, he had to be innocent of bestiality, because bestiality is having sex with a beast, and a bird is not a beast. The case was dismissed, although he was fined £10, because after he'd done the deed with the pigeon, he took it home, cooked it, and ate it. Oh, it's a wriggly topic, this, isn't it? Makes you shudder. In December of 93, James Humfleet, he was charged with the murder of his uncle, Sam Humfleet. And according to the accused, when he was being questioned in the dock, he said he got angry after stumbling across his uncle having sex with one of the two pit bulls belonging to the owner of the trailer where they'd been partying. Had a bit too much to drink, decided to have sex with a pit bull terrier, like you do. Come on, it's happened to us. Of course it hasn't. Father Reform Mohammed Pervez from East Ham in London, he was put on probation for a couple of years for buggering a horse. The case got all the way to the Old Bailey, and the magistrates were told that when police arrived, they found the accused trying to flee from the field with his trousers around his ankles, and the horse was in a state of physical trauma. We travel the world with this. It's not just a British thing by any means. Go to Florida. Patricia Wyatt called the police to report a stray pot-bellied pig having sex with her husband's new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Now, while trying to mate with the motorbike's front wheel, the 50-pound pig scratched the paintwork, causing at least $100 worth of damage, and the animal control officers were uncertain what action to take against the pig, because nobody knew if anybody owned the pig. The bike's owner was a guy called Wal Wyatt. He said, his crime is an alleged sex act against my Harley, and I don't even know if that's a felony. Neither do I. Maryland, also in the States, a man became infected with rabies as recently as 1996 when he knocked over a raccoon with his car, got out the car, saw it, decided to put it in the back of his car and have sex with the dead animal. He was charged with animal cruelty, and he had rabies. In the Lebanon, a man may legally have sex with an animal, but it has to be female. It's legal there. And my final story on this topic, you'll be thrilled to know, is Eaglesville, Tennessee. They charged a man with indecent exposure when it was discovered that the state of Tennessee had no law to apply to the act of having sexual intercourse with a miniature horse. Tell you what, let's move away from that one in a bit of a hurry, and instead I'm going to tell you all about political incorrectness. You know, the world seems to be obsessed with you can't say this about that, you can't say this about the other, and you end up in censorship trouble, especially if you're on the radio and somebody makes a complaint and follows it through. I've been very fortunate in my time on radio that it's never got that far. I always managed to stay on the right side of, well, not necessarily good taste, but at least the legalities of radio. Let's talk about a few people who weren't. Now, I'm going to start way back. The Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. He liked to cheer up his legions of soldiers by having nuns stripped and smeared with honey, and then had feathers tipped all over them. Then they would put them on horseback, riding through the ranks of their cheering men, all naked but feathered. Probably one of the most politically incorrect politicians in the history of the world was the president of Uganda, Idi Amin. Well, he gave himself a title which was Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general, and Uganda in particular. Now, in his time, he had over 250,000 people murdered or executed between the time that he seized power in 1971 and the day that he was deposed in 79. And one of his favourite hobbies was putting statues all over Uganda of his two greatest idols. He loved Queen Victoria because she was strong, and he also loved Adolf Hitler. The third thing that he really liked was crushing the genitals of his victims with his bare hands. Then, to speed up the process, he decided to hand out mass murder contracts to his police force, which was a private police force just belonging to him. They were implausibly called the State Research Bureau, and what they would do is they'd drive around in vans, rounding up anybody that disagreed with Amin and murder them, and then told the families that for £150 they would lead the family to where the person's body lay. The scheme was an incredible success, so much so that neighbours complained about the ceaseless din of machine gun fire at their headquarters. So to keep the noise down, Amin bribed his prisoners to execute themselves by clubbing each other to death with a 16-pound sledgehammer. Now, the scale of his campaign of terror against anybody that he would loosely describe as an enemy was so incredible, it ran into, well, frankly, logistical problems. A former government employee called Kalamazoo was at a wedding when he learned of his own death on the radio, and he quickly fled when he realised he was part of the backlog. They hadn't killed him yet, but he was on the list, so he beetled out the country and survived. Dinner guests at one of Idi Amin's big do's, state do in Entebbe, was treated to some unscheduled entertainment one night in 1972, when between courses, their host, Idi Amin, vanished into the kitchen and came out holding the frozen head of his former commander-in-chief, Brigadier Hussein. Amin screamed abuse at the decapitated head and then started throwing cutlery at it, and it all bounced off because it was still frozen. His foreign policy was also eccentric, to say the least. In 1978, Amin wanted to invade the neighbouring country, Tanzania. But first he decided to lull their president, Julius Nyerere, into a false sense of security. He sent a telegram which read, "I love you so much that if you were a woman, I would consider marrying you." Yeah, Nyerere knew something was happening, and something was very wrong. Amin was a former heavyweight boxing champion of Uganda. He was also an ex-sergeant in the British Army, and he suggested that he and Julius Nyerere settle the war between the two countries in the ring, and he would offer Muhammad Ali millions of pounds to come and referee it. Didn't happen. To mark the anniversary of his coup in 1977, Amin invited the former Prime Minister Edward Heath to fly to Uganda with his band to play before him during the celebrations. He once refused to attend the Commonwealth Games unless the Queen sent him a new pair of size 13 boots. She didn't, and Edward Heath didn't play the gig. Joaquin Balaguer was the president of the Dominican Republic back in the 60s, but only because the United States Marines helped him. They were worried that it would become another Cuba, so he remained in power for the next 30 years because of ballot box fraud. He travelled the countryside in a vehicle with a glass tower, and he handed out gifts ranging from sweets, bikes, bits of land, money, houses, cars. Now, he was known to foreign diplomats as the Wizard of Id. He marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus's visit by spending almost £3 million on a gigantic white lighthouse in the shape of a crucifix. And when the lighthouse was first switched on, it caused a massive and disastrous drain on Dominican's national grid. unnoticed by 60% of the people because they didn't have electricity. Although he was blind and deaf and 89 years old, in the late 90s he challenged a civil servant that he thought was committing fraud to a duel. But he changed his mind at the last minute and settled for making a speech in Parliament instead. China been in the news a lot lately. The ideas of their old leader, Mao Zedong. It was called Mao Thought. It was the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party back after the war. It was the same year he became Chairman Mao. And on Mao's instructions, elderly people accused of being enemies of the lower class were beaten to death on trains, on buses, and in the street. And at the height of Mao's reign of terror, the crematorium in Beijing had a 3-day backlog with corpses. The entire senior faculty at the Zhongshan University was hauled to the front entrance of the campus in the middle of the night, and they hanged all of them from the trees in a mass execution because some of the people in the university were critical of Mao's techniques. A lot of Mao's homicides, murders if you prefer, were dressed up to look like the victims had taken their own lives. The favourite method of killing them by suicide was jumping from a high window. When they didn't jump, they were hurled. But other methods were common, including drowning people in lakes or rivers. The problem is, when you've got a lake with 350 dead people in it, it is hard to say they all committed suicide. They would hang a lot of people from trees. They would put 15 people on a railway line and threaten to shoot them if they moved. Then a train came and did the job for them. And the other thing, he would sit 50 people in a room and force them to drink concentrated insecticide. They died in horrific pain. So, when people say, oh, communism's such a good thing, just remember all this kind of stuff. Mao was also responsible for the world's worst ever famine, a disaster that killed 43 million of his countrymen. But he called it the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, and it was a suicidal socialist farming program based on a plan that had already failed for Stalin in Russia. Throughout the famine, Mao refused to believe that his policies weren't working. At one point, he even doubled his country's grain export, which led to his own country having none at all. Mao made the problem even worse by mobilizing every single person in China to wipe out China's sparrow population. He said the reason that the crops were down was because the sparrows were eating all the crops. They weren't. Over a period of 48 hours, 80 million Chinese people took to the streets. They banged woks and gongs until the birds dropped dead of exhaustion. It was a popular move because the Chinese loved eating fried sparrow. But without the sparrows to control worms and other pests, agricultural disaster followed. With the natural food cycle altered, even more people starved to death over the next 3 years. According to Chairman Mao's personal physician, Dr. Li, Mao Zedong was almost certainly mad through his entire leadership, in contrast to his early days when he maintained a fairly basic lifestyle. But he grew fat, he chain-smoked, he never got out of bed before noon. He would frequently summon his ministers to meetings in the middle of the night, rarely bothered to get dressed, spent nearly all of his time in bathrobes. He only ever wore his official uniform when there were cameras about the place. In the late 60s, Mao confessed to his aides that he hoped the Americans would drop a nuclear bomb on the provinces of China and kill between 10 and 20 million Chinese people. And this would show the rest of the world how crazy the Americans were. I think it was fairly crazy that he even thought about it. Haiti's president, Papa Doc Duvalier, he was another expert in violence, murder, intimidation, but particularly fraudulent elections. When his countrymen went to the polls, they found printed at the top of each ballot sheet the words Dr. Francis Duvalier, President. And when the votes were counted, it announced that Papa Doc had been unanimously re-elected on the basis that his name appeared on every ballot paper, even if people had put a tick in a different box. Then they were asked, do you want your president elected for life? And the answer was yes, because there wasn't room on the ballot sheet to print no. Let's head to North Korea now with their leader Kim Il-sung. He was the last great dictator of Southeast Asia, and he organised his entire country around cult worship of his own personal leadership. He once told the entire population of North Korea to wear lapel badges with his face on them, and he had every road in North Korea built with a third lane just for his use. I think a lot of you have heard of Pol Pot, Cambodia's guerrilla leader of the Khmer Rouge. He adopted an extreme form of communist ideology when he decided to purge Cambodia of all Western influence. He decided to revert to a mythical peasant past. Now, this is a past that never existed, only in his head. He decided to abolish money, to abolish cities, and anything else that he considered to be tainted by capitalism. In 3 years, beginning 1975, he had almost 3 million people murdered. Some of them clubbed to death with shovels, and their crime was being an imperialist. How did he know? Because only imperialists would ever wear glasses when they can't see without them. Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam was an Ethiopian leader in the 70s. He decided to unleash a thing that he called Red Terror against any counter-revolutionaries. He picked on children and young students and massacred hundreds of them. He allowed parents to buy the bodies back, and it was a scheme that he called paying for the bullet. And he had the tortured bodies of his opponents shown on television. And finally, let's have another total flake. Jean Bedel Bokassa. He was a self-styled emperor of a French colony in Africa called the Central African Republic. He loved Napoleon. He had a fixation on him. And when he seized power in the middle 60s, even though his country was officially one of the poorest in the world, he established a vast reputation for spending money on himself. He blew £10 million, that's a third of the country's annual budget, on a 48-hour coronation binge to celebrate his promotion from president to emperor. Now, although all of the world's top political leaders were asked to attend, including Britain and the United States, they all returned Bokassa's invitations. However, some of the ambassadors from Italy and West Germany did turn up for the imperial banquet in their capital Bangui. What they didn't know was that during the meal, Bokassa had arranged to have 12 selected inmates from the Bangui prison butchered, cooked, and served to their dinner guests. So, a little bit of bestiality, little bit of political incorrectness. Blimey, it's just like a night down the big market, isn't it? So let's move on to a proper grisly story. And this is the tale of the plague bonnet of Ardtornish Castle. Now, this is a fine estate looking out upon the Sound of Mull. It was built in the early 1300s. It was home to the clan chiefs of the Clan Donald. And John of Islay's incredibly lavish death procession sailed the Sound, landing on the Isle of Iona for burial. His family would later support an invasion trying to claim the earldom of Ross. Eventually, the ultra-rich and powerful clan MacLean of Duart Castle took it over. They placed one of their lieutenants to oversee it and keep the isle secure. Now this was during the time of London's Great Plague. Many from the city travelled as far from their homes as they could. One man and his family, John Holmes, took as many of his possessions by cart up to the Isle of Mull, and as soon as he did, his family fell ill, and it was obvious that they had carried the plague with them. There was a curse on the Isles, where if there was danger, you would nail your bonnet to their door. As a warning for all to stay away, it was called the Plague Bonnet, and it was firmly hammered in place. On the mainland of Scotland, 15% of the population died, and because of John Holmes, on Mull, it was nearer to 65%. So the Catholic Church said, "Come into the church and God will save you." So everybody went into the church and everybody died. The church said gathering everyone together under God's roof would protect them. Yet the plague fleas just leapt from one to another, leaving everyone riddled with plague sores within days. Huge buboes underneath their armpits, buboes on the back of their neck and around their throat, buboes on their face so big it forced their eyes to close. At first they tried sucking the pus out and cutting them, not realizing that when you cut open a pus sore, anything that the pus touches will become a sore itself. Later that month, those at the castle, who had successfully avoided any outsiders, spotted a plague bonnet nailed to their door. Overnight, 21 of the 40 men inside were infected. They were taken at sword point to a trench, and they were put down like a dog. The bodies, clothes and bedding all burned, and many believe it was this that led the castle to being abandoned. And once the plague had passed, the bonnet kept making the odd appearance on a door of someone ill, and every time it was nailed there, the person would inevitably pass away. Archie Sturrock of the Isle of Mull, a fisherman, awoke in 1811 and he saw a plague bonnet on his door. He returned to his bed and found that his 3-year-old son had choked to death in his sleep. Fiona McBride saw a weird old hat nailed to her front door. Now this was in 1974. She thought it must be the tradition of sorts, so she left the bonnet there. Within 24 hours, her little baby boy had died. In 2013, a visitor staying at a guest chalet on Mull saw an old bonnet hung on a hook by the door. Once again, not knowing the history and thinking it just obviously a quaint Scottish custom, Teresa Hall from Wales left it hanging there and had a lovely week staying with her family and enjoying a nice little holiday. On returning home, within 24 hours, her husband had a stroke. Her eldest son was rushed to hospital and diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. And one night she was returning home from the hospital where she visited her husband, and a truck slid on a wet road, hitting her car and killing her outright. You've got to beware the plague bonnet. It's often not the plague, but death always follows in its path. I must admit, seems to be a bit of a Scottish one tonight, and why not? Now, we've mentioned the Isle of Mull, another famous place where a lot of you will maybe be thinking of having a holiday once you get the opportunity. Oban, the site where it currently stands, has had people living there, ancient man, since 3,000 years BC. A lot of people believe it goes back as far as 9,000 years BC. That's 11,000 years from today. A lot of old sites have been found, caves occupied so long ago it's difficult to date. But the one thing for sure is that the land and sea fed them with fish, shellfish, birds' eggs, gulls and berries. And there's a ghost story in Oban town, dated from around the Second World War. It's about an old chap called Alec McGowan, who'd served in the Royal Navy in the Great War, yet although well in his 50s, he was desperate to serve in the Second World War too. Oban back then was used by Merchant Navy and Royal Navy ships, and as a base for the war in the Atlantic. There was a Royal Navy signal station at Glenavon with an attached anti-submarine facility. They had laid a controlled minefield in the Sound of Carrera to stop any German submarines sneaking in. Just up the road, there was an RAF airfield at North Canal, and they also had flying boats to help watch out for enemy vessels. After the war, this would become a centre for the Royal Observer Corps. However, McGowan was desperate to help any way he could. At first, he became a dock late-night watchman, unpaid but handy for them. The Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy had boats, and they would often let him aboard, treating him like a crew member, giving him a hot cup of tea, occasionally something stronger, yet they would never let him sail with them. He would be the first one to bring mugs of tea to those frozen seamen disembarking in the middle of the night. He helped paint some of the vessels. He would clean the rust off them. And frankly, he would do any of the filthy jobs that needed to be done. Any job that a sailor sought to avoid, old Alec did that job. In 1942, the war in its main, he was staring out along the coast from Oban, and he spotted something that resembled a small periscope. He was staring into the river where 8 British ships were at dock. He notified the Royal Navy, who came out to investigate, telling the old chap that he must have imagined it. With the minefield and all of their submarine nets, they felt it was impossible to enter the horseshoe-shaped estuary. Yet Alec knew he was not mistaken. It seems that the Navy had been told to get 7 of the ships out to sea to avoid them becoming a target. Yet McGowan knew that it was going to be too late. The Germans already knew they were there. A midget submarine had penetrated their defences. No matter how highly up the levels he protested, the Royal Navy Command chose to ignore the old duffer. So orders were given for the ships to sail out the following morning, beginning at 6 a.m. So at 5 in the morning, the submarine net was removed, and the weighted mines held on metal cables were pulled to one side to create a channel for the ships to sail through unscathed. Yet unknown to the Royal Navy Command, during the night before, that mini-submarine had sent divers down to attach mines. So the channel would be blocked by their own sinking ships. Well, around 5 in the morning, Alec spotted a mine floating free, and as there was no one there to tell, he rowed out, put a rope around it, and dragged it close to the shore. Then he spotted another one and rowed off to secure that too. Almost 1 hour later, there was an almighty explosion. The ships, ready to leave, took up defensive positions. And then, having checked the estuary, it was all clear, and out they went. Once the sun had risen, they found 13 mines, all hand-tied to the dock. 11 of them tied around McGowan's old rowing boat and the dock. None of those mines should ever have been loose. They were loosened by the Germans' mini-submarine crew. The Navy divers went down to confirm that they had been cut from their chains and allowed to float, and they could have killed thousands of sailors. Then they looked on the side near Alec's boat, and those mines that the Germans had attached, he had removed by hand and placed on the side near his boat. However, as they looked on the surface of the water, there had been a huge explosion, and there, where the explosion was, there was a bloody pool with remnants of a mine and poor remnants of Alec McGowan. It seems on taking one of these mines that had been attached to the ship, on swimming back to the shore, because he was unable to use his boat, remember, these mines were under the water. He had to swim, and then he had to try and swim back to the shore. Whether he'd hit the mine by accident, whether it had just gone off on a timer, no one will ever know, but it was put down as an accidental explosion. They couldn't prove it had been Alec. There was not enough of him left to identify. Yet despite the Royal Navy dismissing the entire episode, much bigger submarine nets were installed and a far more sophisticated system of defence. And since that day, many people claim to see an old chap mooching along the Auburn dockside. Sometimes he'll wave, but if you get close, he just disappears. A sailor from Glasgow was holidaying on the Isle of Mull in 1969 during the Cold War. The hotline between the USA and the USSR came ashore at Galanack Bay, and the sailor went out for a drink whilst his wife and daughter had an early night, and whilst drinking in a bar and getting rather drunk, he sat down on the dockside to sober up. There, he got chatting with an old man who was called Alec. They chatted about Navy stuff for about 2 hours, and then the sailor, who was a 34-year-old called Williams, said this: "I got up to head back toward digs when the old bugger stood up, saluted, and then disappeared. He was 3 feet away from me. I will never forget it as long as I may live. Ghosts are real, yet I never thought it." Now, last week I mentioned robsonsworld.com. Thank you so much. I'm sincerely grateful to each and every one of you that heads in that particular area, especially at this time. I'm very grateful to you. Please have a look and see if there's anything there that you would like to listen to. There's some absolute classics there, including the time we dove into Loch Ness, or we flew into the Bermuda Triangle in the plane that is most commonly lost, and we flew into a storm on purpose just to see what would happen. We've got many special shows from all over the world. I hope you can find something there that you really enjoy, including, of course, the Alien Jesus series that a lot of people want to download. I hope that you do too. We started this podcast with prehistory and horrific things done to all kinds of mammals, the tall and the short and the tall. However, in Scotland, there is a prehistoric puzzle. The small coastal town of Irvine is probably one of Scotland's earliest ancient settlements. It dates well back into prehistory, long before the Mesolithic. In fact, part of the city, Dreghorn, has the oldest continually occupied inhabited village in all of Europe. Thousands of Mesolithic artifacts, and even some Paleolithic, dating back 2.5 million years. Some faith systems refuse to believe that humans have been on Earth longer than 7,000 years. Yet, in this part of the world, we have absolute proof of early stone tools that were used by man 2,398,000 years BC. That's an awful long way. All over this area there are Iron Age forts built on top of areas used for millennia by different tribes of ancient man. And yet there's something here called the Granny Stone, or the Granny Stone, that has caused consternation over the years. It's described as Irvin's prehistoric puzzle, as people are not really sure what it is, nor where it came from. Scientists have had numerous ideas as how it got there. It's right in the middle of the river at Irvin. Now, some say it rolled down the mountains in a glacier during the Ice Age. Others declare it was the last ancient standing stone from a huge stone circle. The others may be removed by blasting, but they're all, at best, rough guesses. So I looked back through the ancient pagan history and found a couple of stories that could fit. In the Mesolithic period, when it was very busy in and around the Irvin area, there's a story, and it's called The Day the Moon Came Down. Now, this was a time when the moon appeared very, very large in the sky, and some locals, back in those superstitious times, were afraid, believing that it was going to hit the earth. And then, in the early hours of the morning, there was a huge fiery ball that exploded through the heavens and crashed into a lake where the Irvin Weir currently stands. Once again, a lot of the superstitious locals believed they'd somehow offended the moon, so it had smitten the planet. Some pregnant cattle miscarried, some people raced up into the hills and forests to hide. But not one person could explain the huge rock barely protruding from the water. It seemed to sizzle, and the usually chilly water was comfortably warm, even though it was winter. Up to 200 people bathed in the water in that hour, as something had pulled something blazing hot from the sky. Some said it was part of the sun. Some 400 years earlier, another ball of light was said to have landed on a nearby hilltop. People, this is their history, people from the stars had met and befriended locals, taking some with them, and leaving 4 of their own kind to live with them. And then the fiery craft left, promising to return to watch over the people. Some thought that they had angered the sky travellers, and they had fired this odd missile at them. There is another story that we believe gave the stone its name, the Granny Stone, the Granny Stone. In the late Mesolithic, a village elder known as Granny Gee, Grandma Gee, led her tribe in a battle against 3 other tribes united against them. And despite being outnumbered almost 10 to 1, the women of the village, covered in woad, that's blue dye, and bare-breasted, fought alongside their men and snatched an unlikely victory. And at that time, the stone was right in the centre of the river, and it had walkways leading to it, and it was standing on top of that stone that Granny Gee declared peace, freeing the other tribesfolk, provided they remained loyal to her. They stayed loyal to that tribe, and it led to almost 400 years of peace. Let's have another tale. I think we've got time. Something in the air, or about the place called Ayr, the birthplace of Robbie Burns, but it's also home to a horrific and dark legend. Its name being given to it by the pre-Celtic pagans because Ayr means watercourse or strong river, and because of this fast-flowing river that bursts out into the sea, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived here up to 8,000 years BC. so long ago, yet there is an upended standing stone to be seen at the end of Stonefield Park in Doonfoot, said to be placed there as a tribute to the sun, because the sun kept them warm almost every day. Yet it was not the weather that brought death and abject misery to the town between 1545 and 1647. Instead, it was a number of plagues that swept across Britain. This was the pestilence that would kill over 60% of Europe during a pandemic. The Black Death saw people show symptoms within 1 to 7 days. The bubonic plague was vile, causing enlarged lymph nodes called buboes, and if it wasn't treated, the infection quickly spread. Fever, sharp headaches, and overall weakness until those exploding pus-filled sores appear. Then there was the septicemic plague that came on the back of the bubonic. This one would fill your lungs with liquid, creating a loud wheezing. It would give you the chills. It would cause your tissue to die. Your fingers, toes, testicles and penis would turn black and start to rot, hence the name Black Death. Now, as if that was not bad enough, quite often that plague was followed by the third incarnation, the pneumonic plague. That would finish off anybody that was already ill. Your lungs filled with bacteria, and this is the only type of plague that can easily be passed from one person to the other. You felt a shortness of breath, severe chest pain, fever, a bloody cough, and a watery green and bloody mucus pouring from your nose. Now, it was widely believed that Eyre's very first victims caught it from their pets, because the animals, kept mainly outside, were often allowed to sleep inside in the rather dirty hay beds that their owners did. The animals covered in fleas, the owners were inevitably bitten, and their lives lost. Eyre had so many plagues, they ended up with a system to keep the numbers down. At first sight of a plague victim, all pets and animals were either slaughtered or bundled out of the town to fend for themselves. Then the town became under quarantine and made numerous mistakes. Once again, the church said the safest place was the house of God. Yet by putting everyone together, the fleas did what they did, leaping from one to another, until every single person who went to church were dead. The best thing to do for each home was to lock itself down. When Mary Queen of Scots travelled to Ayr twice to escape the plague in London, they had archers on the city walls shooting anyone or any animal trying to get in. Soldiers with their heads covered in grotesque masks hurled out anybody showing signs of the disease, and if those people tried to return, they were shot dead by the archers. And it was during her second visit in 1563 that the local tavern owner was forced to make the ultimate sacrifice. The inn, thought to be on the site of what is now the Tam O'Shanter Inn, it was then called the Ibchia Ayr, the owner McQuillan, was in full lockdown, refusing to open for his own customers. The life of his family was far too important. So one day, he discovered that he had what looked like a bubo sore on his chest, and his blood turned cold. He couldn't tell his wife, nor his 3 children, for they would seek to embrace him. So at about 3 a.m, he left a note and quietly let himself out of the inn. He made his way to the main gate, where there on duty were 2 bowmen. He explained that he was not feeling well, so they should let him out, and he swore never to return. Outside the castle and its town was a living hell. Thousands of plague-ridden souls trying to find food. As there was plenty clean water, the fields and orchards had been cleared. Some tried to fish, until in some cases they wrestled their prey with rotten fingers that would simply fall off. Others, with stumped fingers, wrapped them well and used wooden clubs to try and bludgeon other people to death and put them in the pot, for cannibalism was common. Well, McQuillan managed to get himself outside the vicinity of Ayr, building himself an underground shelter. To the outsider, it just looked like a simple misshapen area of ground. Yet in the soil, he'd hollowed out enough room to sleep and gather whatever food and water he could. And this was in a wooded copse on the edge of a thick forest near Martnacham Loch. The loch provided him with fish and eels. He trapped wild birds, rabbits, and even the occasional boar. He was certainly eating better than his family and really missing them. About a month later, McQuillan had not got any worse, so he squeezed the bubo, only to discover it wasn't a bubo. It was just a boil. He'd gone through purgatory and he'd not even contracted the disease. So he built a very simple hand cart. He didn't have wheels, so he built it with skis. He loaded up quite a haul of foodstuff that he'd collected, a sack of fish that he'd smoked in his burrow, 2 full halves of pig, rabbits, pigeons, pheasants, partridge, quail, eels aplenty, and a few sackcloth bundles of berries, fruit and vegetables. The tricky bit was getting back into Ayr. Well, as luck would have it, Mary Queen of Scots had left, so the bowmen were not in place. Instead, 3 burly wastrels guarded the entrance to Ayr, armed with billy clubs. McQuillan explained who he was, told his tale, and even offered a bribe of free ale once he got back to his tavern. Still, these men gazed at his barrow full of the kind of food they'd not been close to in months. He offered to share that too, but their greed was already encompassing them. If this man was dead, all that food would be theirs. So one invited him in, but McQuillan was dubious, and he held a curved wheat shear in his hand. As the first thug allowed him to walk past, he tried to hit McQuillan with a club, but it hit his shoulder instead. So McQuillan spun around, slicing the face and neck of the guard, causing him swiftly to bleed to death. He gasped, spluttered, and cried out for help as well as he could, with an open esophagus, finally flopping like a fish on the deck until death consumed him. "Now we has a problem," says the other guard. "You've murdered a guard of the city." McQuillan explained that the guard had tried to murder him, so therefore it had been self-defense. The other, slightly smaller guard was rather short of teeth, and he continued, "Well, thwart job to stop you getting in, and you killed him with his efforts to keep you out." McQuillan offered pretty much all he had, for he genuinely did not wish these men any ill. The third guard, who waited patiently at the back, hurled a brick at McQuillan's head that he was lucky to avoid. At that, another swish of his blade, and the small guard's innards were now outards, sliding onto the ground and pulling the man to his knees. And finally the big man came running at him, so the tavern keeper raised a boot to hit him between the legs. And whilst he rolled around the floor, McQuillan lifted a wooden log and slammed it onto his head, and it exploded into a bright red crescendo, sending brain matter across the main barricade. So as it was quite early in the morning, there wasn't anyone else about. So he returned to the tavern, gave his family all of the food, and then entered lockup all over again. A happy ending for once? Tragically not. For as the guards were removed, it allowed dozens of plague victims easy entry to the city. They headed first for the local butcher, infected that family, stealing their food and wines. Then they tried to enter the tavern. During the scuffle, McQuillan's wife and 2 of the children were bitten and infected, leaving only him and 1 boy clear of it. Once he had forced them off, his wife begged him to kill her and also to kill the eldest 2 children, both girls. Instead, he kept them apart from him and his young son, feeding them but having no contact. Within 3 weeks, they were all dead. Then McQuillan saw that he had the disease, as did his boy, and he knew it was all of his doing. Too many of his actions would have been seen to have been heroic right from the initial leaving, yet it had indirectly led to another 40 so deaths. 3 weeks later, he was fairly close to death, his son too, and he decided to end their lives. He boiled up water on his huge tavern fire, and after they had both eaten well, he carried his fever-stricken son into the hot bath, and whilst the child was in there, he sliced his son's wrists. Then he climbed in himself and slit his own, and their plague-infected blood merged as one in the tub. And that's how locals found them almost 3 months later, when the plague finally left air. Their bodies were taken to a beach at Lang Scott's Mile, and along with around 400 others, they were burned on a mass bonfire. Their incinerated bodies allowed to be sucked out at sea by the vicious tides they have there. The ghost of McQuillan is said to be felt if you visit the inn that is now the Tam O'Shanter, and often you can see him walking near the sea on the esplanade or down at that very beach. A time of pandemic, an appropriate story. But if you want something to take your mind completely off such things, well, robsonsworld.com will take you to an incredible world and an incredible ride. I hope you go there and I hope you enjoy it. Until we're together again, stay well for me. Look after yourself and your families. And I wish you well. And don't forget to pop over to robsonsworld.com. Right on the first page, there's a donate button. If you can help us with anything at all, it would be advantageous to us and would help us keep going. Thanks again, and we'll have some more stuff for you next week.